This morning we are talking about belief, faith. What does it mean to trust God with your life? And I want to share with you a couple of interesting stories that come up as we talk about faith. Now, this morning we heard about two people. We heard about this guy by the name of Jacob. And let me tell you a little bit about Jacob. Jacob had an older brother, and believe it or not, they didn't get along. I don't know, how many of you have an older sibling? How about a younger sibling? Do you ever get along? I had an older sister. She was a year older than I am. My brother, who's 9 years younger than I am. We didn't always get along either. But Jacob and his older brother Esau really had it out for each other. And they kept bickering back and forth. In fact, their arguing over each other actually came back even to the time when they were in their mother's belly. Said they were at war with each other while they were there, because they were twins. Could you imagine that? They were twins, but Esau was always older by about a minute. Could you imagine your whole life? I'm a minute older than you. He just held it over his brother that he was a minute older the whole time. And so much so that when Esau came out, apparently, his head came out first and then his foot, and attached to his foot was his brother's hand grabbing hold of his ankle. And so Jacob sort of became known as Grabby. Grabby Jacob. He grabbed hold of his brother's ankle on the way out. Now, some of you mothers are going, what in the world is that about? Difficult pregnancy. That was the only way to describe that. But Jacob and Esau, they battled it out. And one of the things that they were fighting for most of anything else was for their father's approval. Now, that seems to be outrageous, right? Who in the world fights for their parents' approval, right? Everybody. Everybody fights for their parents' approval. But Jacob and Esau did it in different ways. Esau knew that his father was a woodsman. He was a guy who went out, he went hunting. He loved scouting. He went out there with his knife, and he would be able to catch anything in the wild. That was his thing. He was a hunter. He was great with going out and getting what he needed. But his brother Jacob decided that instead of trying to be the hunter like his father, like Esau, he would be the guy who would be at home, making everything nice, tending the sheep in the valley, and making sure that he could cook a good meal. Now, I know that when you're out scouting, it's important to have a good meal, right? So even if it's dehydrated, there's some people who can cook a dehydrated meal like, dehydrated brick, and others who can make a dehydrated meal taste good, right? Who are those people who can cook? We got a few of those folks, right? And you always want to seek them out. Have them part of your group when you're out there in the wild. You want to make sure you have a good tasting meal. Well, the story goes like this, that Esau was out hunting. And part of this was his father said to him, he said, I am really old. And it's the end of my life, and I have one final blessing that I'm going to give to my son. And the blessing I'm going to give to them is going to give them not only the inheritance of all the land that we live on, but it's a blessing from God. Because God has blessed me, and whoever it is I bless will receive that same promised blessing from God. And so Esau said, wonderful. And his father said, go then and get some hunted lamb or ram that's out there and bring it back just the way I like it. And then I will bless you. And so Esau goes out into the wild, and as he's out in the wild hunting, he comes back, and as he is on his way back, his brother Jacob had heard that indeed his older brother had gone out to catch some wild ram out in the mountains. And he conspired. He said, if I pretend to be my older brother, because his father couldn't see so good, he said, if I pretend to be my older brother and I go and prepare this wonderful meal for Dad, guess what? My dad's going to bless me and not my brother. And so Jacob goes about this whole thing, and he gets a ram, and he prepares it, and even while his brother Esau is out there camping, hunting out for this ram, here comes Jacob into his father with this special meal of a ram. And he gives it to his father, and his father says, this is good. And then he blesses him. And he says, I am blessing you with the blessing of God. I'm giving you the blessing of God's faithfulness through all generations. I am blessing you with the land that this land is on. And then the older brother comes in. And he says to his father, here I am. I have made this special meal that you'd asked me to prepare. And he goes, but I just blessed you Just a moment ago, I blessed you with God's blessing. Weren't you that one? And he says, no, I just came back from the field. I was just out hunting all this time, and here I am. I've finally shown up. And he goes, oh, that's too late. I have already given my blessing to your brother Jacob. And Esau was mad. Could you imagine? He was so mad. He was livid. And so he decided that day that Esau was going to chase after Jacob and kill him. Have you ever been so mad at somebody you wanted to knock their head off? That was Esau. He was so mad. And so what happened is Jacob left. Jacob packed up real quick and he ran away. And he ran knowing that God had blessed him, but he wasn't sure how that was going to work out. Now, if you go through the Bible and you read more about Jacob, you'll discover other ways that he continued to try to cheat people out of their best stuff so he could earn what he thought was the best thing for himself. But the story we read today is sort of at the end of this story, where Jacob has now gone off to a foreign country and it's no longer worked out for him. Things have gone bad. And he's on his way back home, but he comes with him with a number of things that he had acquired from being in a foreign land. He had sheep and goats. He had basically had a lot of money. In those days, sheep equaled money, and that was what he brought back with him. And as he makes his way back to see his brother Esau and to the land that he had been promised from his father, he starts asking the question, what about God's blessing for my life? I've tried to do my best stuff on my own. I've cheated other people, but it finally comes down to this. I know that I'm about to have to face my brother. Now, what does Esau want to do to Jacob? He wants to kill him, right? But the only place that Jacob has left to go is back home. He's lost everything else, so now he has to go back home. Well, the night before he goes back home, he's on one side of the river, going to cross over this bridge to where his brother is. And he's heard this report that his brother has come to meet him, right? They're going to have this wonderful reunion. And his brother has actually brought with him 400 armed people. He's brought a small army to visit with the brother. Could you imagine? So he's hearing the report that his brother Esau has brought not just a couple of people, he's brought 400 soldiers basically to come and say hello. Right? I don't think it's going to be like the hello we had this morning. This hello, greeting, good to see you kind of thing. And so Jacob is deeply afraid. He's so afraid that he decides to send out in front of him all the sheep and the goats that he's collected. He sends out the camels and the horses, and he says, when my brother Esau sees you, say that this is a gift from me. That way that he might be appeased. He might not be so angry with me if he sees that I'm giving him some stuff along the way. I don't know if you've ever tried to do that. Give people gifts to make them like you. That's what Jacob was trying to do with this story. And as he is trying to give away his stuff, he sits there at night, looking to the next day, knowing that he's going to see his brother. And something interesting happens. He recognizes that he has a change that's going on in his heart. He's been trying to get God's best for his life through his own cheating ways. And here it is, he is faced with his hardest triumph in front of him, the hardest trial in front of him, and he doesn't know what to do. And so he cries out to God. He says, God of my father Abraham, God of my father Isaac, you have said to me, go back to that country with your relatives, and I will make you prosper. I am unworthy of your kindness you have shown to me. I had only my staff when I crossed over this river to begin with. But now I have become 2 camps. That means all the stuff he sent out ahead. Save me, I pray, from the hand of my brother Esau, for I am afraid that he will come and attack me. And so also he will attack my children and my wives and their children's mothers. But you have said, surely I will make you prosper and make your descendants like the sand of the sea, which cannot be counted. Jacob was remembering that God himself had actually promised him that if you follow me, I will do the very best for you. I don't know if you know that, but God actually wants good stuff for you in your life. God doesn't want to hurt you. God wants the very best for your lives. God's promise to us is for us to prosper, not for our destruction. And I guess part of what Jacob is wrestling with is whether or not he can trust God to really provide the best, or whether or not Jacob can continue on striving on his own to try to grab hold of it on his own. But here he is, on that night before he crosses over the river, and suddenly, as he's camping in his tent, somebody jumps on him in the middle of the night. And he ends up in this wrestling match at night. Do you imagine wrestling all night in a tent with somebody you've never met before? Now, sometimes you think about a bear coming into your camp, right? That'd be kind of scary, right? But what if some crazy guy came and jumped on you when you're sleeping in your sleeping bag? You're wrestling all night trying to get free of this guy. But this guy wouldn't let Jacob go. And they wrestled for hours. That'd be pretty tiring, wouldn't it? And at the end of it, as the sun was starting to rise, this man who had jumped on Jacob said, "Let me go, for it's time for the sun to rise. I'm going to be gone." But Jacob says, "No, I'm going to hold on to you until you bless me. Stop attacking me, bless me." And he says, "What is your name?" He says, "My name is Jacob." And Jacob, of course, his name was synonymous with being a grabby cheater, somebody who would slight you if you had the chance. And he says, "You're no longer going to be called a cheater. You're going to be called Israel," which means one who has wrestled with God and with man and has won. For Jacob, there was this crisis going on in his life. A crisis of whether or not he was going to trust himself for the very best of his future, or whether or not he was going to be able to trust God to provide the blessings for the best of his life. And he was wrestling with this because he honestly believed that his life, if he kept cheating others and he kept doing things in his own strength, he could make it work. He could do it. But when he's wrestling with this person who finally tells him, "You have wrestled with God," he realizes that his real wrestling isn't with other people, but he's wrestling with whether or not God is somebody who can bless him. Whether or not God is the one who can provide for what he needs, the ultimate best in his life. And ultimately, at the end, this angel or this man of God says, "You have won. God has promised to bless you." I wonder if you've ever come to a time in your life where you've had this crisis of belief. A crisis where you recognize that you can either trust yourself, trust your own strength, or whether or not you're willing to trust God with the direction of your life. Whether or not you're willing to trust that God really does have the best for you. Or whether or not you just continue to wrestle it out, to struggle for it. In my life, there was, in 2005, a moment where I had a deep crisis of belief. I was sent by our bishop of the Methodist Church to go and rescue a failing church. This was a new church. It only happened about a year and a half, but they had just started. And when they realized that they needed somebody to go and rescue them, they were down to about 10 people in worship on a Sunday morning. And as I went, my wife and I were both appointed to go and rescue this small church. We started to talk with them about who they were and what they were about. And it became pretty obvious that they had become very comfortable with their group. In fact, when I asked the question, let's find a way to reach out to the community, they responded by saying, "Community? What do you mean? All of us are right here around the table." I said, "This might be a problem." And so in consultation with the bishop and with our church coach who was assigned to us to help us to do this rescuing effort, guess what? Dismal failure. Absolute dismal failure. The church decided, the church coach said, "Why don't you stop doing that worship thing for a while and focus on discipleship of Bible studies with that group of people." And as soon as we stopped doing the Sunday morning worship stuff, that group of 10 said, "We're out of here. We're done." And so it came to me a moment where I said, I've really messed up. Obviously, my best effort here has not yielded the result I was looking for. And I had really thought that this was something I was good at. And so I did what every good pastor does when they find themselves in crisis. I went for a hike. I went up to the southern border of the United States and Canada, where there is the Pacific Crest Trail. And at the beginning of that crest trail, you'll see that there is actually a monument that says that from Mexico to Canada is 2,627 miles. Now, I honestly had no plan for how far I was going to go. I just had a backpack full of granola bars and power bars and some Gatorade and said, "I'm going for it." Now, that's probably not the best way to go for a hike. What do you think, Scouts?
No.
Maybe not. But I knew for me that there was something that I was wrestling with. I was wrestling with this concept of whether or not I could keep on going in this journey. The path that I was on was really hard, and as I kept on going, I found this interesting sign. It says, "Cuidado, caution." It says, "Don't expose yourselves to the elements. It's not worth it. There is no portable water here." You ever seen a sign like this? If you were out hiking and you saw that sign, you might go, maybe I need to turn around. I know I found it interesting that it's only in Spanish. I kept going, I'm not quite sure what this means, but it looks dangerous. As I saw that, I realized that I was having a crisis. And in my own heart, my own life at that time, my wife and I had decided that because of the stress of the job, that we were even going to take some time apart from each other for a while until we worked this out. That was tough. And so I found myself alone in this journey, looking at the dangers ahead of me and recognizing that I didn't know where I was going to go from there. And so I kept on going on this walk. And as I was wrestling with this, I finally came to this camp where I set up this tent, and in the middle of the night it started to snow. Now some of you have had that experience. I remember one of the Eagle Scouts said that was the best time when we were all together and it snowed and it was really cold because they had to bond together in this experience. But for me, when I woke up in the morning and I looked at the trail ahead of me, now this is a desert trail that you could barely find during the daytime. But when it was all covered in snow, all I saw was a giant field of white. And for 60 miles, there would be nothing in front of me but snow. And no real way of knowing whether I was on the right track. And as I was wrestling with that moment, I realized, so far I've been doing my best to make it happen with what I know, with my own strength, with my own resources. But I really felt God was saying, trust me. Can you let go of what you think is best and really allow for me to provide what is best? Because if you keep going your way, you're going to end up dying out there in the snowbanks. Are you willing to let go? Are you willing to say, I'm ready to trust you? That was tough. That was a moment of wrestling. Maybe it wasn't with somebody in the riverbank like Jacob. But in that same way, I recognized I needed to trust God. I learned a couple of really interesting things about that trip. And one of the first things I learned about this is really good practical stuff, and that is never go hiking alone. It's dangerous. There's a lot of stuff out there. As a church and in our faith, there are a lot of people who say that we can grow and connect with God simply one-on-one. I've got my Bible. I know Jesus is up there. I'm good to go. But God doesn't call us to an individual type of faith. The faith He calls us to is a faith of community, a faith where we need at least another brother or sister to help us stay on track. Because it's so easy to lose our path, to lose our way. And guess what? My cooking's not so great. I don't know about yours. But there's other people who have other skills that need to come alongside you in that trip, in that journey. But there are a couple other things we can learn from this. One is that God's plans are not the same as your plans. God's plans require bigger thinking. Because God, who is the one who manages the resources of all the universe, has created and formed you fearfully and wonderfully made, has designed you according to what His plan is for you. Now, we can either trust our own judgment for what we think our life could accomplish, or we can trust God and God's plans for our lives. And believe it or not, at the end of our lives, God is wondering how much of your life, not have you created some great success, not how much money you've earned, not how much wealth you've accomplished, not how many wonderful houses or fences you have had, or cars that you've accomplished, or whatever else. God is asking the question, have you been faithful in your life to do what I have asked you to do? And for the measure that God has for our life is the measure of faithfulness. Whether or not we've been faithful with a little bit. We read that in our beginning readings. Those who are faithful with a little bit can be faithful with much. And God asks, are you willing to trust me? Because God's plans are bigger than our plans, and they require God to be a part of that picture, and not just ourselves. The other thing I recognize is that this crisis of belief is a decision point. It's a decision point about what we really believe. Where we are in our faith, where we are going to place our faith, whether it's in myself and what I think is best, or whether or not I'm going to trust God and what God knows is best for my life. Now, in my own mind, I only have a limited understanding. I am only so mature in my worldly perspective of what God could accomplish. But in God, things are unlimited, according to His best plan for our lives. I'll have to tell you that some of the greatest pains in my life have come about not because I did something bad, or because I purposely went out to injure somebody else or to injure myself, but because I chose what was good, apart from what I knew God had wanted. God had said, this isn't the direction I have for you. And I was like, but it looks so good. It looks like the right road. It looks like it'd be the faithful way to go. I should do this. But God says, that's not what I have for you. And I said, I'm going to do it anyway. And as I walked down that road, I realized, this is not the right road. So many miles detour from the faith journey that God intends. Sometimes things seem good, but when we know God has the best, the choice is between the good and the best, and God says, trust me. Can you put your faith in me and trust me with your life? Without faith, it is impossible to please God. Because anyone who comes to know Him must believe that He exists, and He rewards those who seek Him. God chooses to reward those who are faithful. It's amazing that He does that. He wants to reward us. He wants to give us good things. Another thing that I learned is that faith is not just intellectual, not just a creed. It's not just something I believe on paper. It's not, I believe that God exists, or I believe that Jesus is the Son of God, or I believe this about the Holy Spirit, or I believe this or that. Faith is an invitation to a relationship with God. God says, can you trust me? God doesn't say, will you trust what you believe? God says, will you trust me? It's about a relationship. This is where when Peter is looking at Jesus, and Jesus says, walk to me. Peter initially is looking to Jesus, the relationship of the man whom he had walked with for several years and knew he could trust. He stepped out on the water, and he was walking on the water right up to the point when he took his eyes off the man, Jesus, and looked at his circumstance, and he began to fall. He began to get all wet. Jesus held out his hand and said, Peter, why did you doubt? And it was about the relationship. It wasn't about whether or not he believed the right things, whether or not he had his creed right in his head. It's whether or not he was putting his trust in Jesus, who was there in front of him. God asks us to put our trust not just in our belief system, but in the man and himself of God, that we would know Him. Faith is also seen in our actions. When we come to this crisis of belief, what we do with our life is demonstrated in the way we live it out. Either I'm living knowing that I can trust in my own resources, my own strength, or I'm willing to put my trust, like Peter, on something that seems a little bit shaky. I'm willing to trust that He can take me places that I could not go myself. Faith is demonstrated in our actions. Churches often come to this decision point when we say, what are the things that we can accomplish in the community? What are the things that we feel like God has called us to do? And we can either say, well, we know that we have only this much money, we only have this number of people, and we only have this much time that we can actually do the work in this next year. And so we make our schedule and our ability based on that. But there is a decision of faith, because this is a decision based on what we see and what we know. But God says, guess what? I've got more for you than what you have seen. I have resources of all the universe at my disposal. Are you willing to trust me to accomplish my work in and through your church and through your people rather than through yourselves? Guess what? The world is dying for the opportunity to see God at work. Not just to see church people get busy. God wants to see The people want to see God. And it is said that when people lift up Christ, and Christ is manifested, and Christ is seen, then God will bring the whole world to Himself. Because the world is dying to know of the God who saves. One of the great things that's the same wording from Peter and with Jacob is when they get to that crisis of belief, when they find themselves failing, they both called out and said, God, save me. I don't know if you've ever found yourself in a place where you were really stuck. And the only prayer that seemed to come to your lips was, help! I'm stuck. That's the kind of prayer that God is looking for. The kind of prayer that says, I need your help. He's not looking for long liturgical prayers, oh God of all the great universe and everything else. He says, God help me! I'm stuck. I need your help. And God comes to rescue, to provide what is needed so we can see what God is doing around us. And we have that choice in that crisis of whether or not we're going to continue to trust ourselves or we're willing to trust God with our lives. Jesus looked at them and He said this, with man, this is impossible, but not with God. All things are possible with God. Can we believe that all things are indeed possible with God? This morning, as I've shared with you stories of crisis of belief, there may be parts of those stories that you identify with. Parts of those stories where you realize you kind of came to the moment where you couldn't keep going on your own. What happened in that crisis? I know that for me, my striving to be good or to be blessed, just like Jacob, is just based on my own strength, and it is completely empty and fallen. God desires for His people to look to Him and say, Lord, help us. We are yours. It is in that crisis, that decision, that we place our faith in Christ alone and to know of God who calls us to know Him personally. I invite you to stand as we sing our song of response.